learning today in the schos of Refuah Shalema Ukreva V'harav Moshe Leib ben Zissel. We're also delighted to wish Mazel Tov to Goldie Baumgarten on the engagement of her daughter Esti to Penny Itkin, and the upsharnish of her grandson Mendel Weiss, and to Vivi for the wedding of her grandson Shner Darren, who's getting married to Musi Wolf from Chicago, and to Chayesara Marazov on the wedding of her grandson Mendel Marazov marrying Rivky Kaplan from British Columbia. And everybody should just have Hasidic Shenachas in good health and with happy hearts, and we should only have good tidings to share with each other. A good Chaydish, everybody. A good Geben Shtiar. It was very hard to choose a sicha for this week. They were both, it was very hard to choose. But ultimately, I landed on this one. And the thought process was that there's something very, very edifying in terms of the place of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And I think that that's something that it's good for all of us to have in our back pocket. More and more information about Torah Sheba'al Peh and its authority, and Al Pi Chassidus, its exalted power and place in our Masera. So here we go. Sif Aleph. Kasav HaRambam, B'Hakdamasai L'Sifra Yad HaChazaka. The Rambam writes in his introduction to his Magnus Opus, Yad HaChazaka, otherwise called the Mishnah Torah. It's called the Yad HaChazaka, the strong hand, but it's also double entendre. Yud Daled is 14, and the set is comprised of 14 Svarim, 14 Chalakim, 14 volumes. So the Rambam writes in his introduction, after he delineates the number of mitzvahs in detail, he writes, as like kind of to synopsize, he writes, Elahim Tayig mitzvahs shenemru lo leMoshe b'Sinai. These are the 613 mitzvahs that were told to Moshe at Sinai. Hein v'chlulasehen ufratasehen. These are the mitzvahs in most general terms and in detail, etc. And then the Rambam writes, "V'yesh mitzvahs acheres shenischachu achar matan Torah." And then there are other mitzvahs that were introduced after matan Torah. V'kavu oisam neviim v'chachamim, and these were established by the prophets and the sages. Ufashtu v'chol Yisrael, and they were spread forth. They were promulgated to all of Bnei Yisrael. Kegayin mikra Megillah v'ner Chanukah v'tainis Tisha B'av v'eruvim v'yadayim. For instance, the reading of the Megillah on Purim, lighting the menorah on Hanukkah, fasting on Tisha B'av, the laws having to do with Eruvin, and the laws having to do with Tuma and Tara and washing our hands. Kol elu hamitzvos shenischachu chayavim anu lekablam v'leshamram shenemar leisasor min hadavar v'chulei. And all of these mitzvahs that were new, that were novel, we are obligated to accept them and to observe them, as it says, and this is the link to this week's parsha, and the pasuk was in yesterday's chitas. It's in chapter 17, verse 11, Yud Zayin, Yud Aleph. If you have the outline, then it's on top of the outline in bold. Al pi haTorah sheyarucha, in accord with the Torah that they instruct you, they is the Chachamim, v'ala mishpat asher yarmu lecha, and upon the law that they state to you, ta'aseh, you should act. That's the positive aspect of this. Thank you, Tzippa. And then leisasor min hadavar sheyagidu lecha yamin u'smal, and you shall not deviate from the word that they tell you, neither right or left. And that is the leis haseh of this mitzvah. B'tzarich biur. And this needs explanation. Uba'akdama, let's preface. Kol ksivasei shel Rambam hi betachlis hadiuk. Everything that the Rambam wrote was precise. V'chasher mevi b'chiburei kama inyanim. And when he, in his work, when he speaks of different concepts, darkei l'sakmam, it's his way to summarize, to synopsize, ulefartam, and to list them in detail. And we find an example of such at the very beginning of his work. Lo yistapik haramba b'masha hikdim. He doesn't. He's not satisfied with just saying at the beginning, "V'reisi l'chalik chibur zeh halachas b'chol inyan ve'inyan v'achalik halachas leprakim shabayis inyan v'chol perik achalik oisay l'halachas ktanis kadeshi yu sedurim al peh." First, he says, what I've seen fit to do is to divide my work of laws, by concept, by idea. Then I'm going to further divide them in chapters, and then in each chapter I'm going to divide them in halachas, in laws, and this way they will be easily organized and be easy to memorize them. But he doesn't just satisfy himself with this, elachazar, but then he goes back, la'achri minyan mitzvahs, after he delineates all the mitzvahs, he goes back, umanam v'safram b'pratiyos, he counts them and he tells about each mitzvah in detail, sefer mitzvahs, and then he says, v'ra'isi l'chalik chibur zel arba'as sfarim, I saw fit to divide this work into 14 volumes, ubir shmai v'technesh kol sefer, and he explains the name and the content of each one of the volumes. There's mispar halachos and achlalim b'chol sefer, and he also tells you how many halachos there are in each sefer. Uladugma, for example, Sefer Hamada. In his Sefer Hamada, halachos of chamesh, he tells you that there are 5 categories. Vizes siduran, and this is the order, and the 5 categories are Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah, Hilchos Deis, Hilchos Talmud Torah, Hilchos Avodas Kachavim, and Hilchos Tshuva. And he ends with the 5th category, the laws of Tshuva. Valderech Zeh b'negei minyan mitzvahs. And he does this in his. I'm sorry, I said something wrong before. He does this in Sefer Yad Chazaka, and he does this in the Sefer HaMitzvos. Keshem shediek l'tzayines hamispar kloli shel kol mitzvos hatayra, k'may b'seif hakdama l'fnei minyan hamitzvos. So just like he is careful to list the general number of all the mitzvahs in the Torah, minyan mitzvahs hatayra hanoyhagos l'dayos, sheish meis v'shloisha mitzvahs mehem mitzvahs aseh masayim v'arboim shmeina simalahem v'chulei umehem mitzvahs leisaseh shloisha mitzvahs shiv chulei. So he says that the number of mitzvahs da'araisa that are to be observed for all generations is 613. Of those, 248 are positive, and the siman that usually correlated with the Ramach Ivarim with the 248 limbs. And then there are 365 negative commandments. But then he goes back and he recapitulates. He says this again in a few places. And so at the beginning of every halacha, he counts how many mitzvahs, and he tells you how many are positive and how many are negative, etc. Uladugma, for example, Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah. In his halachas of the basics of Torah, he says, Yesh bichlolon eser mitzvahs. Generally, there are 10 mitzvahs. Sheish mitzvahs aseh v'arba mitzvahs leisaseh. 6 that are positive, 4 that are coached in negative terminology. Umamshich, and he continues, v'zehu pratan, and these are the details. V'chein chayzer u'misakein b'siyum kol echad b'yudal rasfarim es hamispar kloli v'haprati shel hamitzvah shabai. And then he goes back to this, and he again synopsizes at the end of each one of the 14 volumes the general number and then the details of every single mitzvah. Uladugma, for example, b'seif Sefer Hamada. At the end of Sefer Hamada, he says, Nimtzu kol ha-mitzvahs and achlolis b'sefer zeh chamesh v'shivim. In this book, I treat 75 mitzvahs. 16 mehem mitzvahs aseh, 16 of those are positive. Utsha v'chamisha mitzvahs leisaseh. And then there's 59 that are negative. Okay, so once the Rebbe establishes how punctilious the Rambam is and how many times he reviews the number of mitzvahs and their general categories and their details. So then, al pi kol zeh darash bir. So based on all this, we need to explain something. Madua leikasaf kan harambam v'chein matzinu sheniskar hadavar b'shum makay b'sefer hayad mahu mispar hamitzvah shemedivrei sefer. So juxtaposed against how many times he reviews this and how detailed is his review and how detailed is his preamble to each category of mitzvahs, midaraisa from the Torah, it's very hard to understand why he says nothing about how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are. He simply says that there were mitzvahs that were added by the Nevi'im and the Chachamim, and they were spread out to all the Jews, but he doesn't tell us how many. So yeah, we're going to look at the review now for the first part of the Sikha, the outline. The Rambam's writings are exquisitely precise. Throughout the Mishnah Torah, it constantly synopsizes in general terms and then delineates in detail, both as a preamble and as an epilogue to the various sections. He carefully and famously listed the mitzvahs of the Torah, providing an exact listing and explanation for what he included and what he did not. When he mentions the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, the rabbinic commandments, however, he does not say how many such mitzvahs there are. This ambiguity seems completely atypical of the Rambam's style. Okay, that's the first section. Beis. Behine, b'sefer hamitzvahs, Kasav haramba b'she'ei lasai al das habal halachis gedolos shamana kama mitzvahs rabbanon b'minin hamitzvahs. So the Rambam writes in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, and this relates to the question of the Baal Halachas Gedolos, who does enumerate some of the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan in his listing of the mitzvahs. And the Rambam writes, if nimne kol asay d'Rabbanan, v'chol lois asay d'Rabbanan, yeza oilela lofim rabbis. If we're going to enumerate the positive commandments of the Rabbanan and the negative commandments of the sages, this is going to be thousands and thousands of halachis. Aval ein loimer shemitam zeh loitzian harambam es mismar mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Okay, but we can't say that this is enough to explain the reason for why the Rambam is completely silent on how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are. Not enough of a reason. Okay, so there's thousands, there's thousands. And the Rebbe says, on 2 scores, this is not enough of a reason. Aleph, Adarabba, Kevon Sharabim Heim, Hari Nachutz Oid Yoseh Lichsoy Misparam. If you're going to say that there's thousands, that makes it even more important to list them. I mean, Kadesha Davar Yesaya Ladata Mulazachram. That will help to know what those mitzvahs are and to remember them. V'yasera mizu, and even more. Al pi divrei HaRambam atzmai, based on the Rambam's own words, b'negei l'taryag mitzvahs, about the 613 mitzvahs. Shahatam shapirton umanon b'chol halacha v'halachahu kidei lihishamer shelo ye'adar mimenu davar shelo adaber boy uvezichri kol hamitzvahs b'mispar ha'yisi batuach mizeh. The Rambam himself writes that the reason why he listed in great detail every halacha is in order to guard against the knowledge of these mitzvahs disappearing and not being spoken about, and it has to be remembered. And by writing them in the book, this is kind of like an insurance policy that they shouldn't be forgotten. So if this is the Rambam's, this is what fuels the Rambam's work. So the same thing would apply, and the Rebbe says even more so when it comes to the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. So the fact that there's so many would only be a reason to actually list them, not to say, oh, I'm not going to list them because there's so many. Beis, the ikar, and the second thing, and this is the main thing, the Rebbe says, wait, let's dial this back a little. At question is not all the thousands of details. At question is just the most basic mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Al derech elu shemana kana Rambam. Basically, the ones that the Rambam already lists. Kigoy Mikra Megillah v'Ner Chanukah v'Tainis Tisha B'Av v'Eruvin v'Yadayim. Avaloi b'Negei l'Pratehen. We're not talking about him listing thousands of halachas. We're talking about why doesn't he tell us how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are and what they are? And he already gave us almost the whole list. V'oid v'ikar and more, and especially hasha'elakan hi b'negei l'sug miyuchad shel divrei seifrim. And also, let's remember that we're talking about a very specific category. There are so many things that the Chachamim were geyser. They made edicts, they made takanais, they made hanhagais. There were a lot of different things that the Chachamim did. But we're talking about a very specific category. We're talking just about ha-mitzvahs shenischachu v'nitkanu al yadam. V'nitkanu al yadam. We're talking only about the mitzvahs, that not the details of mitzvahs daraisa that they gave us all the details of how to keep it. We're talking about mitzvahs that they were mechadesh. These are novel mitzvahs that they ascertained. We're not talking about the edicts, and we're not talking about all the halachas that created the like the siyagim, like the buffer zone. Okay, things like muktzah and so many other things. We're not talking about that. And these were things shayisifu v'kalu b'soich hamitzvos daraisa oy min hagos v'keitzah. And these were added to or included in the mitzvahs daraisa and in the ways that we keep them. Okay, so like again, like Shabbos is Exhibit A, but Kashrus is Exhibit A, Taras Mishpacha is Exhibit A of this. Okay, so all the halachas of how we keep these mitzvahs, these were set up by the Chachamim, but we're not talking about that category. We're talking about a few mitzvahs. V'sug zeh shel mitzvahs medivrei seifrim hu b'mispar mugbal umuat. This is a very circumscribed, limited, small number. Ubekama mikaimes, and in many places, nimnu zayim mitzvahs d'Rabbanan tuloi. There are enumerated 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, and that's it. So why doesn't the Rambam list them? Should we do the review, or it's not necessary? People should vote. I don't know. I want to do the right thing, but I don't want to take time. Okay, we'll read it very quickly. Okay, review of the second section of the Sikha. In the Sefer HaMitzvahs, Rambam writes that if we were to list every positive and negative mitzvah d'Rabbanan, it would come to thousands. But this does not help in addressing our question of why he doesn't list the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan for 2 reasons. A, if there are so many laws, it makes it more important to list them clearly and comprehensively so that they are not forgotten and are properly observed. In fact, that is how the Rambam explains his careful listing of the mitzvahs d'Oraisa. It would seem the same would apply to the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, perhaps even more so. And B, and the Rebbe says, Ube'ikar, mainly, under discussion are only the core rabbinic commandments, not their many details, of which there are indeed thousands, which represent a specific category. Just the novel mitzvahs that were introduced by the Chachamim, rather than the Gzeres and the Siagim, the decrees and the safeguards that relate to the mitzvah d'Oraisa. The widely held consensus is that there are only 7 such commandments and no more. And this only underscores the question as to why the Rambam does not say this in full-throated fashion. Gimel. V'hine l'cha'era, seemingly, ha'yefsher levarze al pi divrei harambam atzmai. We might think that we could explain this glaring kind of question by using the Rambam's own words, by using his own teachings. Kasav harambam. The Rambam wrote, the Rambam taught, Shekol ma shetzivanu chachamim la'asaisai, v'chol ma shehizirunu mimenu kvar tziva la'asaisai. The Rambam writes very explicitly, so important, that everything that the Chachamim commanded us to do, everything they told us to be careful of, we were already commanded to do this. How? And this is what it says, and this is the pasuk in this week's parsha, Al pi atera sheyarucha v'goimer, that you should carefully hearken to the Torah that they instruct you, and upon the law that they state to you, you should act, and you should not deviate from the words that they tell you, neither right or left. So the Rambam says, everything that the Chachamim will teach you, everything that they taught, it's all included. V'ziranu yizbarach me'avor davar mikol ma shatiknu eisei egazru. And Hashem warned us not to trespass anything that the Chachamim established. Va'amar lo yisasor, and the Torah tells us, and you shall not deviate. Ukamei sheherech bezeh bereish hilchos mamrim. And the Rambam speaks about this at great length at the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim. V'Haramban, and the Ramban, hisig al divrei HaRambam, he disagrees with the Rambam, v'hiksha, and he asked Chama v'chama kushyos, a number of questions, ubeinehen, and among those questions he says, Im nemar shal kol mitzvah medivrei sefer yeshnoi lava aseh. If we're going to say that every mitzvah d'Rabbanan has both a positive and a negative, then we would have to be machmir, we would have to be stringent, and there would be no difference between d'Rabbanan and d'Araisa. And if so, so why do we find that in halacha, l'maisa, there is a distinction? And sometimes this comes up when there's an emergency. And this is something that's studied very much by observant physicians and by institutes like Tzomet in Israel and so on and so forth, that if something does have to be breached, so you have to study, is it a daraisa, is it a darabanan? And there's a hierarchy. So the Ramban says, if the Rambam is saying that basically it's all subsumed in the one pasuk from this parsha, then why do we find that halacha l'maisa, practically speaking, we do see that there's a distinction? And amongst the explanations that the commentators give, they say, that a person that doesn't fulfill a mitzvah rabbanan or trespasses a prohibition of the sages, loy avar l'das harambam ala mitzvah al piater she'erucha ayala lav deloy sasor ki im dafka mi shalei kibel alavas a mitzvah ayas ha'isur rabbanan hainu she'ena moide b'divrei chachamim. So some of the commentators parse what the Rambam is saying, and they say, no, it's not that he's saying that every time there's a aseh and a lois aseh that's at stake with every mitzvah rabbanan. What the Rambam means is that the pasuk from our parsha, al piater she'erucha, which has the positive aspect, and then v'lo sasor, the negative aspect, listening to the chachamim, this is transgressed when you completely repudiate the authority of the chachamim, but not every time you trespass a mitzvah rabbanan. Kileimar. This is to say, ha-mitzvah piater she'erucha v'halav deloy sasor ein perusham etzem ha'asiya ay ha'asiya shel ma shetiknu chachamim. So this pasuk and this mitzvah that you have to listen to the chachamim and you should not veer from what they tell you, it doesn't mean the action or the lack of observance of an action, but rather, but rather it's the overarching mitzvah to subserviate yourself to what the Beis Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin, adjudicates for Jews. It's the obligation to listen to Chachamim. Kibir HaRambam, Benusach HaBracha, like the Rambam explains, he questions, actually the Gemara questions, and the Rambam brings it down and then explains, about the bracha where we say, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvah b'tzivanu, b'mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. How could you say about a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvahs v'tzivanu, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us, and we're talking about Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. It's very clear that we're talking to Hashem. So how can we say that Hashem commanded us on these mitzvahs that only came much later from the Rabbanan? The Heichan Tzivanu B'Torah. Where did Hashem command us these mitzvahs in the Torah? So the answer, that in the Torah it says what the Chachamim are going to tell you, you have to do. So that's where these mitzvahs are commanded in the Torah. Nimtza, inyan hadvarim v'hatza'an, kachu. So we find that the meaning of the words Asher Kidshanu Mitzvanu is Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvaysav shetziva bahen lishmaya me'elu shetzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah ay likros es hamegillah v'chein shar kol hamitzvah midivrei sefer. So the Rambam says it's as if to say that we thank Hashem, we bless Hashem for sanctifying us with his mitzvahs. He gave us a mitzvah to listen to those who commanded us to light Hanukkah candles or to read the Megillah or so on and so forth. And so what do we learn from this? Shahamitzvahs d'Rabbanan einan michulokos lemitzvahs nifrades ela kol hamitzvahs hem nichlales b'mitzvah achas l'shmoya chulei v'lei sasor. So what flows logically from this explanation is that we don't have individual mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, but rather we have one overarching mitzvah, and that is found again in the pasuk from this week's parsha, and it is comprised of a positive component, l'shmaya, to listen to the chachamim, and a negative component, le'sasor, not to deviate from their words. And even more about this, more than this, we find in the Mefarshim, we have this concept in a number of sichas, that when it comes to mitzvahs, when it comes to halachas, there's chefza and gavra. Chefza is the item, and gavra is the person. There are certain mitzvahs that only devolve upon certain items. And then there are mitzvahs that devolve upon every person. Okay, so just like there are mitzvahs, that there are isuri d'Rabbanan, there are prohibitions that the sages put into place according to certain opinions that are not, they don't apply to the thing as much as they apply to a person. Al derech zehu gam b'mitzvahs d'Rabbanan she'einen b'chefza ki im chiyuv ala gavra. So maybe we could kind of take that same paradigm and say that when it comes to mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, it's not about the chefza, it's not about the individual items, it's rather about the person. The mitzvahs on the gavra, the person has a responsibility, a commandment, a privilege of listening to the words of the chacham. And then based on this, we would say, now we would say that's why the Rambam doesn't delineate the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. He doesn't say that there are zayim mitzvahs. He doesn't say these are the mitzvahs and there are 7. He does not give us a circumscribed number. According to this thesis, we would say that he did this kedei lahadgish inyan zeh gufa. He did this to underscore this idea. That mitzvahs d'Rabbanan are not divided into separate mitzvahs. And you don't call each commandment that the Chachamim gave a mitzvah. Once you understand that all the mitzvahs from Chachamim are included in one mitzvah, which is l'shmaya b'kol hachachamim v'leisasor midivrayim, which is to listen to what they tell us to do and not veer from their words. V'hu al derech lahavdil, and a good analogy for this might be lahavdil hachiyuv l'kayim esahiros haroife, the obligation to fulfill what your doctor tells you to do. Shezehu tzivoy hashulchan aruch, and this is a commandment of the Shulchan Aruch. So if the doctor tells you to take a certain prescription, or the doctor tells you to lose a certain amount of weight, or the doctor tells you to exercise, or the doctor tells you to get a colonoscopy, whatever it is, this all flows from the mitzvah to very carefully guard our lives. But it's not like you go to take a blood test and you say, Hineni muchanim zuban lekabel mitzvah say of taking a blood draw. Okay, but we understand that it's all part of this larger mitzvah of an ishmarta ma'id lenafshosechem. V'yasera mizu, and even more so, al derech kiyum aprotim shel mitzvahs kibud av emek yetevazeh. Or think about it. You have an overarching mitzvah of kibud av aim, but the details, how many times to call, cook food or not cook food, schlep up the groceries to the second floor, now all the millions of details, they're subsumed in one overarching mitzvah. Okay, so this is a thesis that the Rebbe sets forth. We're going to review now to explain, to understand it, or to learn it again, but the Rebbe is going to repudiate this in the next seif. Okay, Gimel. It would seem that maybe our quandary, our question as to why the Rambam does not tell us how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are, can be explained with the Rambam's words in which he references the verse in this week's Parsha, in accord with the Torah that they instruct you, and upon the law that they state to you, you are to act. These are the positive mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Do not deviate from the word they tell you, neither right or left. These are the negative mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. And opines that the mandate to fulfill mitzvahs d'Rabbanan is built into this verse. In fact, the Ramban argues with the Rambam and says, if so, why do we find a difference in how we treat mitzvahs d'oraisa, often more strict, as opposed to mitzvahs d'Rabbanan? One of the explanations offered by Mefarshim is that according to the Rambam, a person does not transgress when they violate a mitzvah d'Rabbanan per se. They transgress only when they reject the authority of the Chachamim writ large. It would follow then that there is no specific number, few or many, of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, but rather one mitzvah to hearken unto their words, which are coached in both positive and negative terminology. And this would be similar to listening to all the various instructions from a doctor, because it all falls under the Torah obligation to guard your body, your health very carefully, or of all of the subsidiary aspects of kibbud av aim, which all fall under one general mitzvah. But now in Tzif Dalet, thank you so much, Tiba. The Rebbe says, "Aval be'emes yi efshar liyashiv kein." But in truth, we cannot reconcile our question with the above explained thesis. Ki, because. So first, in brackets, he says, before he tells us the two reasons, he says, this is what I'm going to tell you is in addition, is naisaf al zeh, shadaychek leimar, shashina harambam midarkai, visidroi, bechol ha-sefer kuloi, l'spar v'lim nois, ha'sparti advarim b'inyanim l'tzayin l'spar ha'koilel, rak kidei l'ramez ha'inin hanal. It's very far-fetched, the Rebbe says. You'd be very hard-pressed to opine that the Rambam so significantly, diverted from his normal style in which he counts and he gives you all the details and he gives you the numbers of the mitzvahs in general, the mitzvahs say, the mitzvahs say, how many halachas, etc., that he so starkly veers from his style only to allude to what was taught above. Ubefrat, and especially, shezeu inin ikri, shahayaloi, lekosvoi beperish, be'ezem makom besifrei. And especially because this is such a pivotal idea. If you are to opine that there's only one overarching mitzvah and everything else is a subsidiary of that when it comes to mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, this is a big deal. You would think that the Rambam would write it out very clearly and not just kind of allude to it in an oblique way. But on top of this, in addition to this, the Rebbe says, Aleph, Etzem ha'anocha shebemitzvahs v'yisurim d'Rabbanan l'das ha'Rambam ha'mitzvah eina ha'maiseh kim shmias divrei chachamim. The very posture, the very kind of attitude that in the mitzvahs and the prohibitions of the sages, the actual mitzvah is not a mitzvah itself, but it's rather about listening to the words of the Chachamim. Tzricha iyun gadol. This really needs to be studied. This is a very, very big contention and it needs to be studied. And this is proven from the fact that it's not like there's consensus of all the commentary on the Rambam that this is what he believes. And then the Rebbe says, and really, this is the analogy of everything the doctor tells you to do, not a good analogy for this. Because at the end of the day, to have your blood drawn, take a colonoscopy, do a mammogram, these are not words of Torah. Masha Enkein hatakanes v'amisas medivrei sefer harehin bechlolus kol achas mehen chelek mehalachis v'divrei Torah. But when the Chachamim gave us mitzvahs, these are part of Torah. These are halachos. So you can't compare the two. And because they are part and they are a main part of the Torah Shebal Peh, Hari move on. It's understood. Shagam kiyuman, kigoin kiyum mitzvahs mikra megillah derech mashal, hu al pi Torah mid'araisa ma'aseh shel mitzvah. So it's understood that the observance of each one of these mitzvahs, for instance, take reading the Megillah, listening to the Megillah, is al pi Torah. This is an action of a mitzvah. The lo'ira kiyum shel hatzivui hakloli lishmaya divrei chachamim, and it's not just the observance of the wider or overarching mitzvah of listening to the words of the chachamim. So that's one reason that the Rebbe says we cannot accept the above stated thesis in the third section of the Sikha. And Bays, and second, Al kol panim ein loymar shekavanas harambam kan hi lahadgish inyan zeh b'negei Mrs. Rabbana. And even if we still have to study whether or not you can embrace that whole thesis, but for sure the Rebbe says, definitely it's not what the Rambam means here.
So that means that every mitzvah midrabanan is actually a dairaisa.
The Ramban actually writes that. Yeah. That's one of the reasons that pushed me to do this sikha, because I think that sometimes we might, or there are people who come to us and they might be very flippant about, things that the Chachamim said, and that's why this is such a yesodistic sikha. So the Rebbe says, but in this context here, that's not what the Rambam means. In other words, even if you want to say that this is what the Rambam taught, but not here, ki Rambam mamshich umevar mipnei ma mitzvos elu einan tosefes al mitzvos haTorah. Einam tosefes al mitzvos haTorah. Because here, if you look at the context, you see that the Rambam goes on to explain why these mitzvahs of the Rabbanan are not considered adding to the mitzvahs of the Torah. Now, why does the Rambam have to answer that question? Because there's a pasuk in the Torah that says that you're not allowed to add and you're not allowed to take away. I'll finish and then I'll get to your question. So in the brackets, the Rebbe says, V'zel l'shoinoi, and this is exactly what the Rambam writes there. Im ha'isifu based in chulei derech takanoi derech hayra chulei ein zu tosefes. If the Beis Din adds an edict or they issue an instruction, this is not called adding to the mitzvahs of Torah. Because the Chachamim are not coming and saying Hashem said you should make an eruv, or you should listen to the Megillah, or you shouldn't eat poultry with dairy. The ilu amru kain hayu ma'asifin ala Torah. And if they would say such, that would be considered a trespass, an abrogation of the mitzvah lo'isei sifun. Ela kach anu emrim. But rather we say, Shahanavim and Beis Din tiknum v'tzivu likres hamegillah ba'inasa kedei chulei. But rather we say that the Beis Din, the Nevi'im with the Beis Din, they established and they commanded that the Megillah should be read in the proper time. Now, by understanding the larger context of what the Rambam is saying here, so we understand that it can't be that the Rambam here is saying that there's only one mitzvah, and that is to listen to the Chachamim, because he's taking pains to teach you why these various different mitzvahs are not a trespass of the pasuk in the Torah that says you shouldn't add. If you are going to embrace the above stated thesis, then there's no question that the Rambam has to address here altogether. Halei Rambam gufa madgish b'zeh she'ena mitzayin misparin shel hamitzvos d'Rabbanan shehamitzvos d'Rabbanan eina nechshavos lemitzvos nefrades ela hin mitzvah achas kol is deraisa l'shmaya b'kol hachacham v'lo yisasur midivreim. If you accept the thesis from above in Sif Gimel in the third section of this Sikha, then there would be nothing that the Rambam has to guard against, because basically you would understand the Rambam as saying that all of these mitzvahs, washing your hands before you eat bread, lighting Shabbos candles, lighting the menorah, listening to the Megillah, Eruvin, washing, etc., they're not separate mitzvahs. So there's bechlal no reason for the Rambam to have to say that this is not about Lois Hasifa. There'd be no reason that the Rambam has to address this issue if you're going to understand the Rambam as was said above. The Rambam wanted to have to go into this whole elongated explanation, explaining how this is not an addition. Therefore, so therefore we're forced to say, Shemizeh gufa, shehu tzorach harambam kan, lahashmienu b'negei lemitzvos rabbanan, she'enam toisefes al mitzvos haTorah muchach, that from the very fact that the Rambam has to teach us here regarding mitzvos d'Rabbanan, that they are not considered an addition to the mitzvahs of the Torah, this proves adrabah, the opposite. Shetoichan devarav kan hu shamitzvos d'Rabbanan hein loikim shel mitzvah achas min haTorah shmias divrei chachamim kim lehefach oid mitzvahs. At least over here, the Rebbe says, we are forced to conclude this proves conclusively that the Rambam does not accept this thesis that there's only one mitzvah, and that is to listen, but rather that there are various mitzvahs. And sheyesh chiyuv l'kayim kol achas mehen chiyuv al pi Torah, and that the Torah obligates you to keep all the various mitzvahs of the Chachamim. And this is also proven from the specificity of his wording. Elahem taryag mitzvahs. Okay, this is going back to the beginning of the Sikha. The Rebbe started with this paragraph. These are the 613 mitzvahs. V'yesh mitzvahs acheres shenischachu achar matan Torah. And you see what's being underscored. There are other mitzvahs that were introduced, that were novel mitzvahs that came after matan Torah. V'yesh l'chol mitzvah o mitzvah me'elu perushim v'diktukim. The Rebbe is again underscoring the words of the Rambam, that for each one of these mitzvahs, there are explanations and there are details. Kol elu ha-mitzvah shenischachu chayavim anu l'kabam u'l'shamram. And all of these mitzvahs, we have to accept them, we have to observe them. Kiloimar, this is to say, she'elu hein mitzvahs nifrados acheres, v'loi pratim haklulim b'mitzvah d'leis asur. So it's clear from the Rambam's wording that these are separate and distinct mitzvahs, and they are not just details in the general mitzvah of hearkening onto the words of the Chachamim and not varying from them. And they're ba'ayse sug v'geder shel taryag mitzvahs haTorah haniskaris. And they're in the same category as the mitzvahs of the 630 mitzvahs that were mentioned. Ela shenischachu achar matan Torah chulei. But they were brought to light, they were introduced after matan Torah. And therefore he rushes to say that even though these were introduced later, these are not considered an additional mitzvah. So then the Rebbe says, so now once we rebut what we thought might be a way of understanding why the Rambam doesn't delineate how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are, we're back to square one. Madua loy pirat harambam es misparan shel oisen mitzvahs acheres shenischachu. Why, in fact, does the Rambam not delineate the number of those mitzvahs? He talks about these mitzvahs in the plural. He gives us many examples, but at the end of the day, he does not number them. Okay, let's go to our review, and then there was a question in the chat. So, review of the fourth section of the Sikha. Rebbe rebuffs the above stated thesis on a number of counts. Aside from the unlikelihood of the Rambam deviating from his style of clear and precise enumeration for the purpose of alluding to the above point, which is that all rabbinic mitzvahs flow from or can be counted as one mitzvah, especially because this would seem to be a very axiomatic point. So aside from this difficulty, this very glaring difficulty, there are two additional problems with the thesis. A, the very premise is not accepted by many commentators because, in contradistinction with the examples of a physician's directives, the words of the Chachamim are in and of themselves Torah. It cannot be then that their fulfillment is not a mitzvah, but rather subsumed in the midst of accepting the authority of the Chachamim. You can't compare reading the Megillah, listening to the Megillah to, having a scan done. And B, second, the thesis does not jive with the context of the Rambam's words in the section where he underscores that when Chachamim enact a new mitzvah, it is important that they clearly demarcate it as such. This is very important to distinguish from the mitzvahs of the Torah because one is prohibited from adding to the mitzvahs of the Torah. It seems clear from the discussion that the Rambam is accepting the various takanos, enactments, and actual mitzvahs as exactly that, actionable items rather than a philosophical belief in the authority of the sages. This is further evident from his, it should be exact words. There are 613 mitzvahs, and there are other mitzvahs that were introduced after the giving of the Torah. We are obligated to accept and observe all of these commandments. And this brings us back to our original question. Why didn't the Rambam delineate exactly how many rabbinic commandments there are? Yes, so Hani says there is practically a distinction in leniency when a rabbi is passing something that is midrabanan, but it's only in a very specific situation, okay? But it's not like lechatchila, oh, it's midrabanan, oh, it's no big deal. No, chas v'chalila. And Chassidus actually explains, and there's a famous maimer from the Alter Rebbe that and the Gemara says that in certain things, the words of Divrei Safrim are even more chamor, they're even more stringent than the words of the Torah itself. So this is a much bigger subject, probably we can't get into right now in the middle of the Sikha. But yes, there are sometimes distinctions, and there's no question about that. But in no way, shape, or form does it mean that it's not important, Khalila, or that Bechlal there's leniency, etc., etc. Especially as Hasidim, we know, Hasidim died to keep mitzvahs Rabbanan and even Takanas and Minhagim, etc. But that's a much larger discussion about where the Alter Rebbe explains the difference between midaraisa, midarabana, and that minhagim, and that you're climbing up a ladder. You're not going down a level. You're climbing up a ladder to align yourself further with the Eibishter, with the Ratzon of the Eibishter, and with Atzmos. And I would just say that the pivot here is it's about relationship. If it's about, you're making a cheshbon, how much Gan Eden you're going to get and how much Gehenim you're trying to avoid, it's a whole different discussion. But if you're talking about relationship, then the fact that your spouse didn't tell you to do something and that you went and you did it because you understand that she wants that makes it more precious, not less so. But, okay. Hey, v'yishleimar habir bazer. Okay, so once that we have put that thesis to rest, so now we have to answer our question. The original question is back. Why is the Rambam silent on the number of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan? Rebbe says, we might say that the answer is as follows, and the explanation is as follows. B'zeh shedir karambam v'chazor mana kanas misbar mitzvahs d'oraisa. Sham mitzvahs d'rabanan ein. Sorry, I keep doing this today. Okay, in this that the Rambam reviews and counts the number of mitzvahs d'oraisa. Hein b'tchilas debarav, both at the beginning. He says Elahim tayyig mitzvahs chuleh. Ve'hein behemshach dvarav kishabir kanal shamitzvahs rabbanan einan tisefes al mitzvahs haTorah al ma his hero Torah le'seisif alav le'sigra mimenu shalayein navi rashayi lechadish davar v'lemer shekash baruch hu tzivo b'mitzvah zu le'sif al mitzvah Torah oy lechaser achas me'elu hashesh me'ez v'shleish esrei mitzvahs. So Rebbe says at the beginning, and then later again, the Rambam underscores that there are 613 mitzvahs. And he also underscores regarding the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan that they are not considered additional mitzvahs. The Torah tells us, "Le'seisif alav le'sigra," you're not allowed to add, you're not allowed to detract from the mitzvahs. So a Navi doesn't have permission to just make a new mitzvah and then say, Hashem commanded the mitzvah, and now I'm adding it to the mitzvahs of the Torah. And you also can't get up and say, Hashem said you don't have to do one of the mitzvahs. Okay, there are 613. So the reason that he does this, and in stark contradistinction, he does not list the number of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Hine bazeh gufa bali de bitoy hachiluk be mitzvah shel Torah le mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. This itself expresses the difference between mitzvahs d'oraisa and mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Ha-mitzvahs d'oraisa hein b'minyan u'mispar misuyam v'kavua. The mitzvahs d'oraisa are in a circumscribed, exact, and set number. V'huz harnu, and the Torah warns us, le'seisef alav le'sigra mimenu, you're not allowed to add, you're not allowed to detract. U'b'lashon harambam, and the words of the Rambam, davar barur u'mefurish b'Torah. This is clear and exact, spelled out exactly in the Torah. Shehi mitzvah emedes la'olam al'olmei alamim, and this is a commandment that stands forever. Ein la le'shinui v'le'girayin v'le'tesefes, and there's no changing this, there's no detracting, there's no adding. Shenemar eskol hadavar sharnechi mitzvah eschem oisei tishmor la'asais, like the Torah says, this is in Parshas Ra'eh, everything that I am commanding you, you must observe it, to do it. Le'seisif alav le'sigra. You can't add and you can't detract. Masha ein came, but in contradistinction, ha-mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, harein kalash narambam mitzvahs nischacho. But the mitzvahs d'Rabbanan are mitzvahs that were novel, that were brought to light, that were added. Sherabbanan mechatshim b'koyach ha-Torah, and the Rabbanan add these. They bring these to. I don't know. I'm struggling with how to say mechatshim in English. Somebody help me. B'koyach ha-Torah. And they do this with the strength and the authority vested in them by the Torah, and they do it k'dei lechazek hadas u'letaken ha'olam.
Maybe initiate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. In order to strengthen the religion and to heal and fix the world. And these are the words of the Rambam, Hilchas Mamre. V'hainu, this means she'etzem minyanon hu hahefach mispar mesuyam. It means that by definition, once you understand what mitzvahs d'Rabbanan are all about, you understand that by definition they cannot be limited. And therefore he cannot list how many mitzvahs d'Rabbanan there are. Because the whole idea of numbering or listing an exact number, that can only apply to mitzvahs d'oraisa, because they're non-negotiable and they remain eternal. You can't add, you can't detract. But mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, by their very nature, are about proactively adding what needs to be added based on the conditions of the world and the era and so on and so forth, in order to bolster the Torah itself. Okay. let's do the very, very quick review on the fifth seif. We need the next page. Sorry. Thank you. The fact that the Rambam is so precise about the number of mitzvahs deraisa, but is completely silent about the number of mitzvahs drabanan, teaches us the difference between these two categories. When it comes to mitzvahs in the Torah, those have a set number, and we are enjoined not to add or subtract. In contradistinction, mitzvahs drabanan are by definition responsive to the state of the world, which means that they are constantly, at least theoretically, able to be generated. This is a dynamic rather than a static rubric, and cannot therefore be limited to a specific number. Now the Rebbe addresses something that we're all thinking about, which is, really, when was the last time that there was a mitzvah drabanan added? Vav, Yisera Mizu, even more, Me'achar sha'ala chachamim mutal chiyuv la'asoi siyag la'Torah. This is not just that they have a privilege to do this, that they have the authority. This is a obligation for the chachamim to create a buffer zone around the Torah so it should be kept properly. La'asoi siyag la'Torah, a gate around the Torah. And they have this responsibility to do this lefi masha hasha tzricha, based on what the time calls for. And it's very possible, it's plausible that there will come a time where there will need to be more gezeres, more takanos, more minhagim, mitzvahs drabanan, va'azai, yutala chachamim chiyuv loisifon. And then the chachamim are going to have an obligation to add. And then Bnei Yisrael will have an obligation to observe those additional things from the Chachamim, because we have an obligation to listen and not to veer from the words. And even though practically at this time it's not possible to add more mitzvahs rabbanan, Sharei ein lanu based in Hagadol, sheyesh b'koichei lahisif takanos, because we lack, unfortunately, based in Hagadol, we lack the Sanhedrin that has the authority to do this. Harish state shuvas b'davar, but the Rebbe says, but not so fast. But the idea that the category mitzvahs rabbanan will always be a dynamic category, even when you don't have the based in Hagadol Sanhedrin, it's very important to understand two things. Ratius, first of all, the fact that you can't practically add more doesn't change the nature of this category. Because according to halacha, there is the possibility of more mitzvahs being added if a Sanhedrin should arise. And specifically, if we're talking about when Mashiach comes, and every single day we say that our judicial system will be restored. And this is like, and it's aligned with, it's parallel to what the Rambam explains, B'Sefer HaMitzvahs Shalai. He explains in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, B'tam Shemona Bein HaMitzvahs, Gamis Mitzvahs Hashmada Zainu Umais. He explains why he includes the mitzvah to annihilate the 7 nations as one of the mitzvahs. You would think it doesn't belong there. Even though it's not a mitzvah that is done in every generation. And the Rambam says one of his axioms, one of his corollaries is he doesn't include mitzvahs that are not for all generations. But why does he include the annihilation of the 7 nations? And these are exactly his words, how he explains it. The Rambam explains that when you're dealing with something which practically can't be done, but if it could practically be done, would have to be done then that is a mitzvah for always. So in other words, practically, these nations, as they can be identified as such, have been annihilated. So practically, there's no action item now. But should they arise, theoretically, then there would be an action item to annihilate them. Because these mitzvahs still have to be observed in every generation when there is the possibility to observe them. אתה צריך להבין ולהסבינן בהבדל בין המצווה ובין הדבר שנסתיו עליו, כי יש שתהא נהגס לדיירס, אלא שהדבר שנסתיו עליו כבר נדר בדור מן הדיירס. So the Rebbe says, the Rambam says that you have to distinguish. There are things that can only be done in certain generations, and there are things that are not actionable because, for instance, in this case, the 7 nations have disappeared. The 7 nations as such have disappeared. But the mitzvah itself is still a mitzvah in every generation. So the Rebbe says, it's the same principle in what we're talking about here. Even though in this present era, in this present date, we don't have a Beis Din Hagadol, we don't have the Sanhedrin that has the power and the ability to add mitzvahs. Adayin be'ina ha'alacha v'hamitzvah shebezeh. But the halacha and the mitzvah that Chachamim can add still remains. Sheyesh biyad Beis Din l'chadesh u'l'hasiv mitzvahs rabbanim b'zman hazeh. Theoretically, there would be the power in the Beis Din Hagadol to add more mitzvahs. That's number one. Vishenis, and second of all, Karav Loimar, it's close to say. In other words, we have it on good reason to say, Shaladas HaRambam, that according to the Rambam, Efshar bepoel lechadish takones begeder mitzvahs rabbanon gam bisman she'ein lanu Beis Din Hagadol. See, it would seem from the writings of the Rambam that he would opine that even when you don't have the Beis Din Hagadol, when you don't have the Sanhedrin, there could still be additional takanos and even mitzvahs rabbanon. V'hu al pi divrei Rambam makdamasu l'sefer hayad, and this is based on what the Rambam writes in his introduction to the Yad HaChazak of the Mishnah Torah. He writes, "Kol hadvarim shebegemara habavli chayavin kol Yisrael leleches behen." Everything that is written, that is legislated in the Talmud Bavli, all of Bnei Yisrael are obligated in these things. V'koifin kol ir v'ir v'chol medina medina linhag b'chol hamenhagay shenagu chachmei hagemara, and we force every city, we force every state to comport themselves in alignment with what the chachmei hagemara taught us, the ligzar gzeiroisam, and to kind of bolster their edicts, and to go in the ways of the statutes that they set up. And this is true, even though the Sanhedrin that was comprised of 71 judges had already folded quite a while before the putting together the Gemara. Seeing that all the things in the Gemara were agreed upon by all of Klal Yisrael. And this was ratified by all of the Chachamim that made these takanas, they made these gezeras, they made these hanhagais, they adjudicated a certain way. Heim kol chachmei Yisrael or Rubam. It's all of the chachamim that were alive at that time, or the vast majority. So umizeh shetakana iminak sheskimu aleim kol Yisrael yesh lahem b'chol hazmanim toikev shel mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. So the Rebbe says that we can prove from these words of the Rambam himself that even when there's not a Beis Din Hagadol, if hiskimu aleim kol Yisrael, if you have a situation where there's consensus among Klal Yisrael, then this has the strength of a mitzvah rabbanan. Ubefrat, and especially the Fidas HaRambam, and especially according to the Rambam's opinion, sheyitochi matzav, that there could be a situation shabai hiskimu kol hachacham shebe'eretz Yisrael limnois dayanim v'lismach oisam, va'azai nasa Beis Din shel dayanim smuchim Baal toikef shall based in Haggadah. There could be a situation where all the Chachamim that are in Eretz Yisrael, they choose certain judges and they rely on them, and then they basically get the strength of the Beis Din Hagadol of the Sanhedrin. V'achiyuv l'shmoya mikol Beis Din Hagadol eina tolui klal b'zeh she'habeis din yoshev b'lishkas hagazis. And the obligation to listen to everything that the Beis Din Gadol tells you is not dependent on the Beis Din Gadol, the Sanhedrin, sitting in the Lishkas Hagazis, which is where it sat in the heyday in the times of Beis Hamikdash. So now let's review. So the Rebbe teaches in the 6th section that Chachamim have an ongoing obligation to safeguard the Torah when necessary to legislate new rules, and Jews have an obligation to observe these gezeres. Practically, since we lack a Sanhedrin, this is not applicable. But still, this does not fundamentally change anything, as the responsibility to add gezeres is inherent to the Chachamim. And this parallels the Rambam, including the annihilation of the 7 nations in his list of mitzvahs, because it's still a mitzvah, even though pragmatically those nations no longer exist, so there are no nations to destroy. Conceptually, however, the mitzvah remains so long as there is a possibility that these people could exist. And so too, while practically we lack a Sanhedrin today, but the imperative and power for Chachamim to legislate remains. And B, it is conceivable, based on the Rambam's writings, that he would rule that new gezeres can actually be introduced even without a Sanhedrin. Okay, so now the Rebbe now talks more about this idea that there's consensus that there are 7 mitzvahs. So the Rebbe has explained why the Rambam doesn't give us a number. The reason the Rambam doesn't give us a number is because it's not over till it's over. And there's still an obligation and a possibility for Chachamim to legislate. Are you going to say there's no Sanhedrin? Okay, but the Rebbe explains that even so, based on the Rambam's own words, and based on the idea that conceptually there could be such a thing, it's still an obligation, and therefore the Rambam does not list the number. Now the Rebbe is going to go in the last 2 seifim. In the last one, it's going to be Al Pi Chasidus, and in this one, he is going to take us more deeply in this idea of 7 mitzvahs. V'hinei, af al pi shebekama sfarim nimnu hamitzvahs drabanan b'mispar kavua zayin mitzvahs drabanan v'hamispar zayin hu b'diuk u'b'dafka. So although in many sfarim the mitzvahs drabanan are numbered by a set number 7, and the number 7 is specific. And is well known that the 7 mitzvahs drabanan, when you add them to 613 mitzvahs daraisa, you come to a number which is 620, taf reish chaf. And then when you transpose those letters, you get Keser Torah, the crown of Torah. On Mahai and for this reason, Matzinu Shaseres Hadibers HaKolelim Kol HaTorah Kula Yesh Behem Tarach Eis. And for this reason, we see that in the Aseres Hadibers, which includes all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, there are 620 letters. You know what? I made a mistake on the outline. I wrote words and not letters. That's a mistake. It should say 620 letters. Okay, so there's the Taryag Oises. There are the 613 letters. B'chol Ois. In every letter, Nirsham Mitzvah Achas Mitayig Mitzvahs. And in each one of these letters is kind of embedded one of the 613 mitzvahs, v'zayin oisius hayiseres, and the 7 remaining letters, him zayin mitzvahs rabbanim. These are the 7 mitzvahs rabbanim, k'may shekasav hakadmayim. Harein ze klal b'stir lanal. So here we have this idea that there are 7 mitzvahs, and here we just concluded by saying that it's still It's still in formation. And that's why the Rambam can't say 7, because there could be more. But the Rebbe says it's not a stira. It's not a contradiction. Keep us firm, elu medubar al oifen hayes hadavar bepoil, koilel gam lo asid lavai. Shemilmaila nikva shebepoil yesheva mitzvahs rabbanan v'lo yeser. It's not a stira, it's not a contradiction, because in the Sfarim that wrote that there are 7 mitzvahs, that's talking about what there is practically. That from above, Hashem set it up, that practically speaking, there would be 7 mitzvahs rabbanan and not more. And practically speaking, there are not going to be more. And so these 7, together with the 613, together we have 620, and this forms Keser, this forms the crown of the Torah. But if you're looking at the category mitzvahs derabanan within the rubric of halacha, of legislation, yesh makam lahisafas oid mitzvahs. There is room for there to be more mitzvahs added. And even to the mitzvahs that would be added would apply the words of the Torah, that you have to hearken unto the words and you cannot veer from them. Besignan achaktas, to say this in a little bit of a different style. The fact that it's revealed before heaven, as it were, that practically there's only going to be 7 mitzvahs rabbanan, it doesn't in any way, shape, or form change the halachic possibility of there being more mitzvahs rabbanan, and even more. The Rebbe says every person has volition. We have freedom of choice. Therefore, we could do something against the Torah. So because we have freedom of choice, and because we can act out in different ways, the Beis Din has not only the possibility and the privilege, but they're mechuyev to add more takanas and more gezeres to meet the needs of that time. And everybody would be obligated to keep these. And just to give an example, based on the Rambam's own teachings. Okay, so the Rebbe is going to parallel this to what the Rambam explains about, on the one hand, the omniscience of Hashem. Hashem knows everything. And on the other hand, that we have free agency. And the Rambam writes about this, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yodea Kol Mashiyah, that Hashem knows everything that's going to be, and at the same time, Einay Machriach as Bechiras Ha'adam. It doesn't force a person to choose in a certain way. Umayse Ha'adam Biyad Ha'adam. A person's actions are in their agency. Rishus l'chol adam nisuna imratza lahatais atzmai l'tzatayva v'liyat tzadik harishus biyadei. So a person they have agency. They can choose to veer to the side of good. They could be a tzaddik. And the opposite is also true. They also have agency to do the opposite. The main point here is that the fact that the Eibush knows everything that's going to happen doesn't impact your choice at the moment that you make them. That still belongs to you. So Rebbe is drawing a parallel that on one hand, Klape Shmaya Galia, heaven, it's revealed in heaven that there's going to be 7 mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. On the other hand, the Beis Din still has agency, moreover, chiyuv, obligation, to set new legislation should the time call for it. Okay, we'll review. There are many authorities who have set the number of mitzvahs d'Rabbanan at 7. That number combined with the number of mitzvahs daraisa, 613, comes to 620, which is the numerical value of the letters in Lashon HaKodesh of Taf, Reish, and Chaf, which are the letters that form the word Keser, crown. The Aseres HaDibros, the Ten Commandments, which includes all the mitzvahs of the Torah, is comprised of 620 letters, not words. That's a mistake. Still in all, from a halachic perspective, there is a potential for more rabbinic mitzvahs to be added. The fact that it's revealed before heaven that 7 is a set number does not change the fact that it is possible for Chacham to add more. This is in consonance with how the Rambam reconciles Hashem's complete and total knowledge of all with the retention of free will on the part of man. And now we go to Seif Ches. Al Pi Hanal, based on everything said above. Shezeh Sharambam Eina Meines Mispar Mitzvot Rabbanan Hu Mitzad Zeh Shal Pi Halacha Ein Lehem Kol Minyan V'Hagbala V'Hedem Medida V'Hagbala Zehu Al Pi Halacha Hilchas Torahs Emes. So based on the above, that we concluded that the Rambam cannot enumerate the mitzvahs Rabbanan because Al Pi Halacha there is no number, there is no limitation. And the absence of a limit, this is al pi hilchas Torahs emes. This is according to Torah, that there should not be a limit. Yesh loimar, we might say, sha'adavar matim ha'mavor b'sifrei Gedolei Yisrael, sha'mispar ha'meduyak shel sheva mitzvot rabbanan mashlim es mispar tarach keser. So now, going into the chassidus of this, we could say that this specific number, and what the chachamim say, that this specific number, when it's joined with the 613 mitzvahs d'oraisa, form the word keser, it teaches us something very profound. And we find two things about halachas in Torah. We find that halacha sheb'Torah nikrois taga, kisra shel Torah. One thing we find, one teaching we have about halachas is that they're called the crown of Torah. Umeidach, and on the other hand, ein lahem mispar. They have no number. There's no set limit. Kamesha Kasov, like it says in Shir Hashirim, va'alamis ein mispar. So literally this word means maidens, but we're taught al tikri alamais elo oilamais elu halachas deleis lun cheshbana. Don't call them maidens, call them worlds that are created by the halachas that have no number. It cannot be limited. V'havahatalya. And these two teachings are mutually interdependent. The fact that halachas are called the crown, and the fact that they're infinite, that they cannot be circumscribed. From the fact that halachas are called crown, harehin b'li mispar. So by definition, they're without number. Ubedugmas keser gashmi, shehu lamayla min haresh, umakif es haresh. For example, take a material, physical crown. It's above the head. It encircles the head. Hainu shehu lamayla min adam. It means that it's higher than the person, meaning it transcends the person. Crown speaks to transcendence. And at the same time, but at the same time, an actual crown has to fit the head. So on one hand, it's transcendent, and on the other hand, it is connected to something that is circumscribed. So a crown that's going to fit on one person's head is not going to fit on another. It's either going to be too big, it's going to be too small, and that's not good. Al derech zeh bekeser elyon. And the same thing is true with the idea of the celestial crown. Shehu l'mayla min midida v'hagbala. On one hand, crown transcends any type of measure and limitation. U'b'yachad zeh hu keser da'asiya d'sira v'chulei. And at the same time, it jumpstarts all of the worlds, and every single world is about limitation. So on one hand, it's about infinity, and on the other hand, it's about limitation. V'lachein And therefore, halachos, which are the crown of Torah, they cannot be numbered. And aligned with this, a little bit differently, a little bit different stylistically, and now we're going to drill down and we're going to talk about mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. Asher shaychus l'Torah shebal peh yoyse me'asher halachos stam, ki halachos hein biur perish l'Torah shebechsav, v'ilu mitzvahs b'divrei sefer hein mitzvahs acher shenischatshu. Then when you're talking about the things that the Chachamim taught, the Rebbe says you have to divide. There's two categories. There's the halachas of Rabbanan that expound upon and give us the way to keep the mitzvahs d'oraisa, and then there's a second category, the mitzvahs that are complete chidush, those 7 mitzvahs. Umitzat sheichus l'madrega de keser hari shnehem leloi minyan v'hagbola, and because both are connected to the idea of keser, both of them cannot be enumerated, they cannot be limited. So even though, practically speaking, in how we keep it, there is a circumscribed number. There's 7. But when you're talking about them conceptually, not practically we know there's a circumscribed number, it's 7. But when you talk about them conceptually, and therefore in the Rambam's book, because he says his book is about halachas, so Naisa ben chidush gadol b'lashon Rambam atzma kanal shemisparin oile lalafim rabim b'poyel. So the Rambam alludes to this idea of infinity by saying that there are thousands of them. B'poyel, practically. Way transcending the ability to count, and certainly not on a scale with 7. So even the Rambam, the Rebbe says, is alluding to this idea of infinity. It's not just idea in Chassidus. It's idea that the Rambam embeds in his halachas. Through learning halachas generally, which are referred to as the crown of Torah, azai kol hashayna halachas b'chol yom muftach lei shehu ben olam haba. The Rebbe brings down the Gemara that everybody who reviews halachas every day is assured that he will enter olam haba. So we'll do the review. The correlation of the total number of mitzvahs, 613 plus 7 equals 620, being aligned with the concept of keser, crown, underscores 2 teachings about the halachas of Torah. A, they are referred to as crowns. B, they are infinite in number. Because halachas are the inyan of crown, they are by definition without an end, just as a physical crown sits above the head, transcending the person, and at the same time is sized to fit their head properly, meaning it simultaneously surpasses and is based upon a limited aspect of the person. In like manner, the celestial crown, the halachas of Torah, transcends all and yet is the source of all the worlds, which is by definition limitation. The halachas, the crown of Torah, defy quantification; they are infinite. Drilling down further within halachas, there are 2 categories: those that are based on and further amplify or define the mitzvahs of the Torah, and then the second category is the rabbinic mitzvahs, the 7. While both are connected to keser infinity, the 7 mitzvahs Rabbanan, although practically delimited to 7, have a greater connection to infinity, to the immeasurable potential for novel halachas to be generated. The Rambam therefore refers to there being many thousands of these in reality. Through studying these halachas, referred to as the crown of Torah, may we be zeicha to the reward promised to anyone who studies halachas daily, which is Olam Haba, the world to come. But look at us. We already are in Olam Haba because we have the Rebbe Sichos.